Okay, this time, so previously we kind of gave a historic overview of personality processes and linked them back to different person perceptions, different paradigms. At the end of the module, Mason almost fell out of her chair. So that was pretty entertaining. So if you skipped around, you might want to check that one out because it's mildly entertaining. So yeah, this time we are going to talk about processes of perception and how they relate to personality. Alright, so in terms of perception, and this is an entire field of psychology, sensation and perception. Just understanding all the inputs and how we perceive them is a huge chunk of psych. It's kind of the early foundations. A lot of the early research, like I'm thinking of Titchener and Wundt and Ebbinghaus, all kind of did some of this work. And it was super cool. But anyway, let's keep going. So people are predisposed to perceive the world in different ways. For example, dominant people tend to be more sensitive and more receptive to visual displays on a vertical dimension, as I have displayed here, this kind of top-down, versus those that are less dominant tend to be more receptive and more inclined to horizontal displays. You may notice that throughout this lecture series, most of mine have been kind of top-down, so you can gauge that is one area of facet of extroversion that I'm pretty solid on. I find it to be helpful, and while every once in a while I'll have kind of like horizontal, I don't do it as often, because even though in hindsight I probably should, to keep all the different people on the various continuum receptive. But yeah, so that's kind of just a broad diatribe. But let's talk about priming and chronic accessibility. So priming is the activation of a concept or idea by repeatedly or recently perceiving it or thinking about it. This tends to affect the speed at which concepts come to mind and help explain differences in perception. Now, what do I mean by this? There's a general tendency called chronic accessibility, that, like a tendency for an idea or concept to come easily to mind. Some ideas come faster to us than others, and they're chronically, I feel like chronically is not the right word, but that's the word the book uses, and so I'm trying to keep it consistent. But they're more able to come to the surface. So these are parts of our personality because concepts that are constantly primed become part of our personality. They are also more likely to, certain personality traits are more likely to respond to things that they've kind of been chronically accessing. Neuroticism is kind of a classic example here. But stepping a little back, some of this may come from evolution. So some of the kind of almost instinctive things that we perceive include recognition of gender, fear/dislike of spiders and snakes, and just the classic caveman stuff, which I know is not all of what evolutionary psych is, but for shorthand and for the sake of this module, we're going to go with. Now, these also probably relate to temperament, which are, the book bounces around with definitions here. So the one I have written up here is one tendency is to experience positive versus negative emotions. So, but it's kind of like the genetic basis of personality, the non-environmental stuff, the instinct stuff, and I don't know how I feel about that characterization, that genetic is innate, and that temperament is genetic, therefore temperament is innate. But that's kind of the thinking, and this is not an area that I conduct research, so I'm going to defer to the perception people on this, even though I think that they're doing a little bit of genetic, cognitive, or how do I phrase this? They're kind of a genetic fallacy. But anyway, we are getting off topic. We as in me. And as a consequence, you are too, but that's my fault, not yours. Alright, so lastly, we got experience. That's another way that chronic accessibility and priming can influence your perceptions and in turn your personality. So this is probably the biggest influence. So all that non-shared, or all the environmental stuff, it's kind of, so it's based on the importance of traits to others, around whom one is frequently, around like who you're frequently about. So for example, parents, and this is somewhat related to culture. Your experiences will influence how you perceive things, what aspects are most accessible. Sorry, there's like 5 different like tiny little windows for screen capturing. Okay, so some classic examples of perception-based processes that are related to personality include rejection sensitivity. So what do I mean by this? It's being especially aware of suggestions of impending rejection. And it's primarily in cases where there's ambiguous signals and how you interpret those. So the pessimist may interpret any hint of rejection as rejection, even if it's ambiguous, and it's possibly not. So they err on the side of rejection rather than it not being rejection. So this often creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where people high in rejection sensitivity respond to these ambiguous cues with anxiety and even panic, and they can result in these kind of aspects can result in seemingly inconsistent behavior depending on whether or not the cues for rejection are present. And they've done some really cool studies about this. Again, I encourage you to check out the book because it goes into more detail. So another aspect, another example of things that are pretty like authoritarians are a little more rejection sensitive than most, which I find very interesting, or those that are high on the trait of authoritarianism are a little more sensitive. So the snowflakes. Sorry, that was flippant. But let's talk about aggression as another example. So aggression tends to be related to it's related to a tendency to perceive others as having hostile intent or as a threat. Regardless of this, so if there's ambiguity, they tend to interpret things through the lens of, it is aggression or a threat. And so they are more likely to remember let me back up. So their memory may be related to more hostile themes or hostile people, but this is like an automatic perception. And so their perceptions of hostility may influence how they perceive everything. And this is an automatic perception that can be overcome if someone slows down and thinks before responding, or generally has been practicing mindfulness and mindfulness meditation. So you can overcome these kind of initial automatic perceptions by taking a step back and then reacting. That like classic counting to 10, when you're angry, there's a reason. It's like it slows you down. It gives you a moment to reinterpret through a healthier, more productive lens. So, perceptual defenses. So these are really similar to psychoanalytic defense mechanisms, and I would say that Funder would argue that this is psychoanalytic research, but let's back up. let's tell you what perceptional defenses are. So they're the screening out of information from consciousness that might make an individual either anxious or uncomfortable. Now, people will still have a physiological reaction to these anxiety-provoking words before they're consciously aware of them. So they'll have the reaction, but have minimal recognition of it. And for example, when the words are presented very briefly, or when words that provoke these kinds of emotions are presented briefly, people will start sweating before they said they could see them. And what does this mean in terms of implications? We might be able to avoid conscious awareness of things we find threatening. That's the idea, that there are some, this thing, oh god, I'm blanking on the word. This word is the thing that holds the camera. The stand. Oh god, the clamp. The one that kind of looks like this, but for the camera. It's super wiggly, because I wanted to be able to adjust it more, but because it's super wiggly, if I do anything, everything jiggles. Wow, I apologize that I am incapable of using the English language. Okay, let's keep going. Vigilance and defense. The idea here is to ask ourselves, why do people tend to see exactly what they fear most? Those that are shy are more likely to see social rejection everywhere. And there are a lot of different possible answers for this. Mouse, come on. Their defense mechanisms might not work well enough to just block out those super stressful things. So they perceive the threatening stimulant consciously. Now, people do differ in the degree to which they are perceptually vigilant versus defensive. That's an individual difference, folks, right there. Okay, next time, we're going to talk about processes of thought and consciousness. And hopefully, the video doesn't cut out. I'm kind of waiting it out because it tends to do this. Or once I hit 4 gigabytes of film, it cuts out, and then I've got about a second and a half of dead time. And I'm waiting.